after e4, c5, knight f3, knight f6, we're looking at knight to c3 as a third move. We're still going to go through e5 first, and then a bunch of other options. Black plays d5 immediately, and in previous videos we went through the whole swaps variation. What happens after e5 now? Black moves back to d7. The idea is to play knight c6 and put more pressure over the square e5, especially taking advantage of the fact that white doesn't have a pawn in d4 to protect e5, and so white will have to play d3 to play bishop to f4 to protect the pawn a little bit further, or maybe queen e2. Both moves, d3 or queen e2, will block the white bishop. So white should play bishop b5 immediately. However, we need to look at this variation. Knight takes pawn in d5. This is not a free pawn that we're giving, because black takes the pawn in e5 with an attack on the knight. So there's several options now. We're going to look at all of them. Let's start, for example, with a move that looks typical in these positions. d4, attacking the knight. The idea is that if black plays, then white can place a knight in e5. But as you can tell already, this is wrong, because black takes the knight, check, queen takes back, defending the knight in d5. Now e6, attacking it. And after the knight moves, let's say knight f4, either way, you can take the pawn in d4. And black is up a pawn. There's no compensation here. White has got nothing. Even bishop b5 checks, playing all the best moves. It's fine. You play knight to d7. You cannot play bishop d7 here. You don't want to allow things like queen d7, queen b7, and so on. So after castle, you just attack the bishop, ask him a question where he wants to go. Let's just look at two quick lines, and then we move on to the different one. Bishop to d3, for example, attacks the square h7, so that when you're done developing the bishop and then castling, white will have some idea of coming on the h file, for example, obviously. So in d3 it looks like the bishop is well placed. Anyway, nothing to worry. Bishop d6, hit after rook e1. All of these doorbell moves, they're not going anywhere. Black plays knight to e5. Best response by white is queen to g3, targeting g7. But still, we don't care, because you're going to take the bishop in d3. And this is a crazy line. White plays queen to g7, attacking the rook. Well, if he doesn't, remember that it's extremely important that you've neutralized the white bishop, the light square bishop. So you've already got an advantage. I'm just showing this line because what happens is really crazy, because now black plays knight takes rook in e1, then queen takes rook check, king d7 now, also to avoid things like knight to d5 check with the bishop coming in g5 and giving a check. It looks really dangerous, so you gotta play king to d7 and not e7. And now the black player is just upping material, is gonna take the pawn in c2, attacking the rook. So a swap is not favorable. If that happens, then it's good for the black player. So after queen d4, winning a pawn, pinning the bishop, black's best move is queen to a5. And it looks like bishop d2 actually attacks the queen and the knight, and the white player will be better, but instead black plays knight to c2 with an attack on the queen. And the last move of the line will be this one, queen d3, saving the queen, keeping the attack on the black queen and attacking the black knight. Black plays queen to f5. Black goes to a winning endgame with an extra piece. So in this position, after a6, we went through bishop d3. What happened after bishop a4, keeping the pin? Black plays queen to a5, attacking the bishop immediately. So white loses the activity by going to b3 with the bishop. b3 is not possible, obviously, because after you remove the rook from the diagonal of the queen, then b5 is threatening to trap the bishop. It's a stupid move. So how does white lose activity by going to b3? Well, knight to c5, threatening to win the bishop pair, and after bishop to c4, b5 unfortunately is not possible because of the attack on the rook by the queen. However, black just goes on with g6. It's not like black is winning or anything, it's just more comfortable. White loses the advantage, and this knight is weirdly placed. The bishop can't move, so after best move queen e2, the idea of going to e5, attacking the rook, allowing the development of the bishop to a square that makes sense, because again b3 doesn't make sense to develop the dark square bishop. Black is just in perfect time to play bishop g7, and after bishop to d2, best move is queen to b6, attacking the pawn in b2, and after rook protects it, queen to d6, black keeps a pawn advantage, no compensation at all. And there's nothing to worry after bishop to b4, pinning the knight. You just play b6 to defend the knight. And right now the white player has to move the knight because it's being attacked. So even after knight d3, putting more pressure on it, you just got nothing to worry, go on and castle. So at this position, What happens after white takes the knight with check? You have to take back, and now it looks like white has won a pawn in b7. Nothing to panic. Black plays rook to c8, and after rook to d1, best move to attack a pawn. Of course, you cannot take immediately because you got queen e1. Black plays e5. The two pawns are protecting each other. The white knight has to move. Knight d5 is nothing to worry about. Actually, the white player will have to be careful. Bishop e6 puts double attack on the knight, and after the knight goes to b6 to attack the rook, it looks really good for white, but black simply plays queen to b5, pinning the knight. And now white will have to play the only good move here, which is a4, attacking the queen, but then simply queen to c6. And after swapping, the black player has nothing to worry. You go on to the end game with a bishop pair. If the white player really wants to continue the game, right now, if you think about it, white has a pawn advantage. But black continues with bishop to c5. The knight is pinned, so white has to play a5. But now black castles and has a threat of winning the game immediately with rook a8. Again, the white player will have to know this line perfectly, which is it's just impossible. Or play like an engine after the only move, which is queen to d3. Black takes the knight in b6. After pawn takes back, bishop to d5, threatening to take in g2. So after the best move, queen g3, black plays rook f to e8, protecting the pawn. And this pawn is going to fall, the pawn in b6, plus black is about to play rook e6, rook g6, and it's just going to be too much attack. And it's also unstoppable. So I don't know, bishop developing, then rook e6. So you're going to take this pawn, you're going to go to g3, and black goes to a comfortable endgame. But this is to assume that white will have played the absolute engine moves all the way until now, which is very unlikely. You're likely to win the game before that. So in this position, one last line I wanted to show was just to complete it with knight to d3 instead of knight to d5, which exposes white a little bit too much. Black continues with bishop to d6. So right now there's no material advantage for the black player anymore, but we have the bishop pair and most importantly, development that allows us more freedom. So bishop to d2, for example, only square where it makes sense to go. Black continues with queen to b5, proving that he is happy to swap. This is the best thing to do for white. After taking, and we take back with the bishop, black is just better off in the endgame. Also, the threat now is to take the pawn in c2, so after rook a to c1, black plays f6. We have an incredibly strong pawn chain in the center, and white will never be able to break through because the bishop is attacking the knight. So after knight b4, black's best move is king f7, ready to develop the rooks. Position is evaluated around -2, and once again, in this specific video, I've made white play the best moves only of this specific line, meaning that if you know this line very well, you're going to win it each time. Yeah, the advantage is not crazy. There's not many like sharp, crazy things that maybe look very exciting, but we're getting ready to play this Nimzowitsch at very high level and win no matter what. After e4, c5, knight f3, knight f6, and knight c3, black continues with d5, and after e5, knight e7. So we are looking at this move, knight to d5, knight taking the pawn. As we said, we have to take the pawn in e5. So in the previous line, we went through d5 and everything that happens next. Let's look at this line that looks better. Bishop b5 check. Now the move I like to go on with is knight b to c6. So the knight in c6 is pinned, so it looks like this knight is free, but once again we have an attack on d5. Two moves here are popular. Knight taking the knight with the idea of going to c6, or c4 supporting the knight in d5. In that case, actually threatening to win the knight in e5. Okay, so let's go through knight takes in e5. Now queen takes, and now you may argue that the white player might want to break the pawn structure by doubling up and isolating the pawns. So knight c6, for example, you take back, and now the bishop has to move. Well, this is actually not very good for white. The white player will have to go all the way back to f1. For example, if white goes to a4, you've got this, well, you've got queen e4 check, winning the bishop, right? But you got this cheeky move first. Queen g2 attacking the rook, threatening to win more material, so rook goes to f1 and then queen e4, winning the bishop. In this position, if bishop goes to e2, this is an idea, because after queen to g2, which is actually the best move and you should play this, white can play bishop f3 attacking the queen. It's protected by the white queen and it's also targeting c6. Still, you have a move that saves it all, queen to g6. And now white just doesn't have this attack. So there's nothing now. Let me just show you one of the lines just to illustrate how the game more or less should go, because you might argue, yes, black is up a pawn, but we have this doubled an isolated pawn. How to continue? So d3 to develop the bishop. Black goes on with h5. The idea, of course, is to play bishop g4 and after a bunch of swaps have a rook on an open file. Bishop e3 idea, if in case the white player wants to try and castle alongside and then just get the rooks on the file of our queen. Bishop e3 is also targeting a pawn and is developing a piece. This is met with queen to f6, putting pressure on b2. So how the game goes on now, there's too many possible moves. So I'm just going to go on with the line that I've encountered myself and just show you the best moves in that line. And by the way, this seems like a free pawn, bishop to h5, but in reality black achieves what he wanted, to open the file for the rook. Black is just better now. It's like the advantage is like minus 150 at the moment, so it's not great of course, but we're just out of the opening and we're black. Most importantly, black plays g6 and now the bishop goes back and black goes on with rook to b8 for a plan that I'm just about to show. So to better illustrate it, let's go back a few moves. Instead of taking this pawn, what happens after black just played queen f6 and now white plays bishop to c5? Okay, rook to b8, so it's a very similar plan to the previous situation where we gave a pawn. Either way, we're gonna infiltrate in b2 no matter what, and fianchetto the dark square bishop. There's one line though, where white plays d4 immediately. This stops our initiative over b2, but the move to remember now is e5. It's the best move. The idea is to take the bishop and then castle, with a great advantage. White can either take our bishop in f8, for example. It looks weird because it looks good for white, and then we have to move the king. Bishop takes pawn in a7 is not recommendable because black just gets a better and better advantage by going to b2 with the rook. There's no compensation whatsoever. But then black starts threatening bishop b4, so that's no good. So let's look at this variation where bishop takes. Now we take back with the king, and now the infiltration on the second rank is inevitable. Right now there's double attack on the pawn in d4. If white plays c3, then we can just isolate it. So after pawn to d5, let's look at this because it's interesting. This is where things get a bit more interesting because you get to understand so much about how the endgame of this specific Nimzowitsch goes. Bishop to g4. We're happy to give up a pawn. The reason is we've got developed rooks. It doesn't matter that our king is in f8. So we've got double attack on the bishop, so the bishop has to take, and after take back, and now the queen takes. Black makes use of his rooks by going to h4, skewering the queen and going for an attack on e4. If the white player moves the queen away in a defensive way, then we can take another pawn or simply infiltrate in the second rank. If queen gets aggressive, goes to d7 with an attack on the pawn, maybe supporting the pawn while it goes down. Still, black wins after rook e4, so that doesn't work because rook e4 check. Well, obviously king going towards the queen side will allow us to infiltrate with the queen and give a checkmate soon. Either way, also king to f1 loses because black plays g6 to give king luft, and nothing really stops now the black player from winning. We're going to take the pawn in d5, and in case white plays queen c6 to try and swap pieces desperately, well, this doesn't stop us from playing queen to f3, threatening checkmate, and this is unstoppable checkmate because rook to g1, then you just do check, king moves, check with the rook, king moves, and then queen f3, checkmate next. And if instead here white plays king to g1, then this doesn't change anything because queen check, only move is king f1, then check again, only move, and then checkmate. So here we are, and in this position we took the knight, right? We went through bishop e2, bishop a4, and everything that happens next. What happens after bishop to f1? This move simply proves that the white player only went to b5 for the sake of breaking up pawn structure, which might arguably be worth it, depending on what type of player you are. However, black will have to now punish this problem. What's the problem? The problem is the bishop can't develop without the pawn in z2 being lost. White has to pay a price for swapping everything, or at least the central knights and central pawn, and the price is it's too late for him to castle anywhere safe. So after h5, what is white going to castle? He can't play the fianchetto because he'd win the rook. He can't move the rook because then he'd lose the right to castle. h5 is there to support the bishop in g4. Always remember this pattern. So let's see what happens. Since in this opening the white player has decided to go back and forth with the bishop, we'll see what happens since the bishop is locked, white tries to develop maybe this way, bishop e3, queen d2, maybe castle long. Still, we have a very powerful queen that cannot be attacked, by any knight, meaning we have huge control of the board, attacking this diagonal, potentially going to this square in case the white player will ever dare castling that side. So it's really ugly. White is not losing, but it's just an ugly game to play. Black goes on with the thematic rook b8. So there's not much to do now, because this move with the rook has just ensured that the white player will never castle any side of the board. So let's look at this type of move and how to exploit it. c4. This is not a bad move, but it will have to be punished. Queen to d6, and now the idea is to play bishop to f5 and start attacking the backwards pawn. So after bishop to e2 though, it looks like the c4 move has been able to remove the queen from the diagonal where we were attacking the whole board. So after bishop e2 and g6, it looks like now white can castle and everything is okay. And yeah, it is. If white's a good player, then he can continue this game. Bishop to g6. And now with this double attack here, you're willing to take that pawn. So after rook to b1, of course the pawn cannot push. So rook to b1. And now black continues the bishop to 5, putting more pressure over the backwards pawn that can never push because you take it for free. Also, the black player will be able to castle and play rook to d8, and that is when the attack on the d3 pawn will be finalized. So let's look at this line where white plays bishop e3. The idea is to play queen to d2, maybe put the rook on d1 without suffocating the bishop in c1. This is not a poison pawn. Bishop to b2 can happen because there's a queen defending in b8. So that means that if white plays queen to c2, putting double attack on the bishop, you can just go back with the bishop. The thing is, you don't have to go back to g7 because after a swap of rooks, then take, then maybe white has a pawn in c5. That doesn't look any good for black. So from here, you have to go to d4. There's nothing there for the white player. So let's go on a few moves just to see white playing the absolute best moves in the position, and black still going on to a winning endgame, although it's not that easy. But after take, and now take, the white player has played the best option, which consisted of forcing the pawn of taking in d4, because obviously in this type of positions you'd rather take back with the queen so you can keep putting pressure on the pawn. So we see we're happy to keep the double isolated pawn, because after castling and the rook comes into game, then you are just gonna play for this pawn and then win on that. But in this case, after the swap of bishops, black has to take back with the pawn, and now white can also activate the rook in b1. So white is playing well. Black has to go back to d6, and after rook to b7 with an attack on the pawn, black's best move is the castle and even give up the pawn. That's fine. Black plays rook to b8. We're gonna finish the line here. Black has an advantage, and an idea of playing queen to b4 and going all the way up with a check, forces swaps, and then finally hit the backwards pawn. So after a3, kind of a forced move, black continues with queen to g7, and after h3, giving loof to the king, black plays h4. And yeah, you have to sort out how to continue the game from here. White has played literally like an engine for the last 20 moves, so you don't have to worry that this very game will happen, because you will have won it long before. After e4, c5, knight f3, knight f6, knight c3, d5, pawn pushes, and then knight d7. We're looking at the variation where the knight takes in d5. Okay, so we take back, and now bishop b5 check, knight c6. So let's look at this line where white plays c4. Okay, we take the knight in f3, check, queen takes back, and now bishop to d7. The white player has done nothing but give us the very strong f3 knight, and he hasn't been able to break the pawn structure as he did in the previous examples. He has no reason to take the knight right now, unlike in the previous lines. So after, let's see. Normal moves. Castle, black plays e6. The knight has to move again. And now, of course, going backwards with the knight is not convenient. Again, it's not like white is losing or anything, but black will go on with a6, and white will have to give up the bishop pair after bishop takes, and he can take back. It's just really good for the black player, so there's no point of white playing like that. So let's go on with bishop to a4, avoiding the swap. Still, black goes on with bishop e7. He's in perfect time for castling. He doesn't have to worry about the weakness in g7 or anything. After white develops the last piece, which is the bishop d3, black plays b5. This is a great move. And of course, going back to b3 just allows knight d4. You're winning the bishop pair. Bishop c2 does the same. Bishop d1. Well, we're going to get there in less than a minute. So I'm just going to skip this and go on through what happens after pawn takes. because bishop d1 will just give a better position for black. So what happens after pawn takes b5? It looks like a free pawn for white, right? You're going to play knight to d4, and after the queen moves to g3, doesn't have to worry about forks here because there's a knight in c3 still. And you also don't have to worry about the pawn in g7 because bishop f6 would be a great thing for black, because then the white queen will have to move again, the bishop will be saving the rook, and then the rook is coming to g8. So it looks amazing. Black now goes on with pawn takes b5. So queen to g7, you have a Zwischenzug, and then you also have an attack on the bishop. So the bishop will have to move. Bishop b3, you can't play it because knight b3 is free to be taken. The pawn in a2 is pinned. Bishop c2 also is not possible. And here we are back at bishop to d1. What's wrong with this move? Well, it proves that the white player has just moved from f1 to b5 and a4 and then d1. I don't think that this is the best way to play. Black goes on with castling now, is completely safe and doesn't have to worry about moves like bishop to f6, of course, because you got knight f5, which wins on the spot. No, the moves is possible, like bishop e3, you still play knight f5, bishop d2. Same thing, you play knight f5, and then when the queen moves, you play b4 attacking the knight, and after knight e4, it looks like you can play a normal game, but like now you're able to go on the weakness of the isolated pawn. And this is just a fine endgame for the black player. Bishop e2 to defend is not possible, or c2 either, because knight d4 will fork it. You'd be able to win either the queen or the bishop. Well, definitely the bishop. Your opponent is not going to give you the queen, but then you're going to have an attack on d3. There's no compensation for white. After e4, c5, knight f3, knight f6, knight c3, d5, and then they push the pawn, knight to d7. So after taking the pawn, we take in e5, and after the check, knight c6, we're looking at the variation where white plays c4. Okay, now we take the knight in f3 check. Always take that knight if you can, because that's the best piece of the white player, at least in the opening. Queen f3, and now black continues with bishop d7, safeguarding the integrity of the pawn structure. After castling and black playing e6, we notice what happens after the knight goes back to c3. What happens after rook e1? Definitely the better move. It's more active and it's pinning the pawn. And if we play bishop to e7, of course, white will happily give up the knight for the bishop and go on to the endgame with the bishop pair. Black plays bishop to d6, and we will get rid of this annoying knight by castling. So let's remember what the problem is for the white player in this opening. The c4 has compromised the defense of the pawn d, and so the pawn d can never push, and it's going to be a backwards pawn. So if you want to develop the bishop, you're going to play d3. You have pretty much the same problems. So what happens in the fianchetto type of game? We haven't seen this kind of idea, so let's go through it. Castle, and now of course bishop b2 is not possible because you'd win the knight, so the knight will have to move again. Knight to c3, black plays knight to d4. It was going to happen anyway because you're attacking both the queen and the bishop. And you're also threatening the square c2 with the fork. So after queen to d1, black plays the beautiful move. Once you learn this kind of move, you really are going to be such a stronger player. Bishop to c8. How deep is this? It's one of those slow moves that no one will think of playing. Like, you have a bishop developed and now you undevelop it. Why? Because you look at this pawn structure, the white player couldn't play d3 because it will be a backwards pawn, it will be a target forever. I mean, it's still a stupid pawn because white played c4, but the white player did this fianchetto thing, and you're now going to target this silly bishop, which is blocked. So the idea, of course, is to play a6, and even then it doesn't look like you're trapping it because a6 and bishop a4, then there's a pawn in c4 protecting b5 further, but still bishop to c8, grandmaster move. So after bishop to b2 developing, black plays a6, and after bishop a6 a4, how do we continue this b5 attack? Well, we can't play right now. Black plays f5 first. The idea of stopping the knight to e4. This is such a beautiful move. So after knight to e2, best move according to the engine, and also putting a lot of attack over d4, black plays queen to h4. Remember this, always see if you can ignore a threat that your opponent is making against you so that you can keep threatening stuff yourself. Queen to h4, obviously going for something big like queen h2, king moves, queen h1, knight blocks, bishop h2, looks amazing. Also because the king will not have access to e2 because of our knight. So white has to do something. What? Okay, white has to be careful. A move like g3 will be punished horribly by knight f3 check. And let's go on a few moves. King g2, black plays the excellent queen e4 move, threatening this card check. There's nothing to do here. The knight cannot just go to c3 with an attack on the queen. The queen can't move anywhere on the diagonal, that's true, but your knight e1 is a double check, right? So the best move according to the engine is knight f4, which really doesn't change much because knight e1 check, double check, and after the best move, king to h3, black saves everything with knight to d3, and he's up just a lot of material. So in this position, the best move according to the engine is f4. Here you have to take, and of course g3 here looks like a fork, but you still got to play knight f3 with devastating consequences. It's not the best thing to do. So after knight takes bishop, neutralizing the attack of the black player and winning the bishop pair, looks like white could actually do okay, but then the queen takes back, black is just better. And remember this bishop here in a4. So after rook a f1 attacking the queen moves away to d6. We're threatening b5. We have the defense of the knight as well. The white player, if he wants to save this bishop, will have to inevitably give up his own bishop from the fianchetto, losing his best minor piece, and then the queen will take back with a check, and pressure forever will be applied on the pawn in d2, and black is going to a very comfortable win